love you so much.
Yeah, I love you too. I'll see you later. Relationships are really complex things with a lot of different kinds of processes going on. But one of the most important processes that I just want to mention first is called social cognition. Now, social cognition is the process of attending to, interpreting, and remembering information about ourselves and others. It's how we form opinions about other people and manage other people's opinions about ourselves. So we do this kind of social cognition in many different ways. When it comes to friendships, a few of the different kinds of factors I want to talk about, the ideas that explain how friendships work, would be things like attribution theory, impression formation, social exchange theory, social status, and interpersonal attraction. So I'll just briefly talk about each one of these. Attribution theory refers to this idea about how we make inferences about the cause of human behavior. So whenever we do something, whenever somebody else does something, attribution theory just helps us to understand, how do we figure out the cause. Now, you can make one of two kinds of attributions. You can say that that person's behavior is because of, the kind of person they are. It's like, this guy cut me off on the freeway because he's a jerk. That's a dispositional attribution. I'm pointing the finger at him. I'm saying that that guy that cut me off is a bad person. And that's why they did what they did. But I could also look, instead of just looking at the individual, I could look at the context. I could look at their environment. I could make what's called an environmental attribution, where now I'm just recognizing that the reason why this guy cut me off is probably because, he has somewhere he really needs to be, like his wife is in labor or something like that. So it's not really, his behavior doesn't really tell me anything about him. It's just the situation he's in. But most of the time, we don't do that. Most of the time, when we see other people do things, we don't look at the environment and take into account the fact that there might be very good reasons why people do things they do. It's not simply because they're jerks. But we don't do that, and the fact that we generally don't do that is called, there's actually something that we can use to explain that. It's called the fundamental attribution error. So the fundamental attribution error just is the name we give to this tendency to attribute the actions of others to internal causes and the actions of ourselves to external causes. So this is kind of like an actor-observer bias, where when we do something bad, we realize that, I had to, I was forced to. It was just the situation I was in, I had no other choice. But when somebody else does something bad, he's just a jerk, right? We kind of make that snap judgment. It's most oftentimes really unfair to not treat people in the same way we would treat ourselves, but like I said, it's called the fundamental attribution error. It's fundamental. You really can't avoid doing it. But if you want to see just more examples and hear a bit more about what the fundamental attribution error is all about, I've actually included a really cool link to a video. So you should check that out. The next thing I wanted to talk about is impression formation. And this is the process of just kind of trying to understand the way other people see us and change that to a more, positive thing. The next thing I want to talk about is impression formation, and that just refers to this mental process of how we develop our judgments about other individuals. Now, whether you like it or not, whenever we first meet people, we tend to kind of get these snap judgments about them based upon things that are obvious. Like, we judge people initially on things like their gender, race, age, how they dress, how physically attractive they are, and so on. So the most obvious things are the things that are the most important initially. But as time goes on and you get to know the person better, these stop having so much importance. But that initial impression, that initial first meeting you have with the person is going to color that relationship for a very long time. Your opinion of a person will be significantly biased if they make a good first impression. And it can be similarly negatively biased if they make a bad first impression. So that's why we say things like first impressions count. You could completely ruin your opportunity to have a relationship with a person if you make a bad first impression. Now, something that goes along with this impression formation is just how we manage other people's impressions about us. So, impression management just refers to those intentional steps we take to try to manipulate other people's opinions about us and what kind of a person we are. Now, one of the primary ways we do this is by trying to get feedback of some sort. This might literally mean, asking people how they feel about you, but more often than not, we just kind of look for little subtle cues. We look for nonverbal kinds of messages that will communicate whether or not we are making a good impression, we're making the kind of impression that we want to try to make. So we definitely incorporate that feedback into the intentional steps we take to try to improve people's impressions of us. The next big theory I wanted to talk about is one that I think you'll really like, especially if you're into just math or economics. It's called social exchange theory. And the primary idea of social exchange theory is simply that social exchanges and relationships work based on basic economic principles. So it's kind of like a barter system. If I give you some sign of affection, now you kind of owe me a similar amount of affection. Let's say we're just walking down, I'm walking down the street and you happen to be walking the other way. Well, if I recognize you and I wave and say hello, it's going to get really weird if you don't pay me back. If you just pretend like you didn't hear me, if you don't say hello and wave, you're breaking the deal. You're not, paying for the kind of treatment you just received. And that's when it starts to get really awkward. But you can also apply this theory to just how we maintain our relationships with people. The basic idea is a relationship has to be profitable for you to want to maintain it. I'm sure if you think about all your different friendships and other relationships, you can definitely agree with me that some relationships are much more profitable than others. The benefits of maintaining that relationship greatly outweigh the costs. But with other relationships, it's not such a great balance. With other relationships, the costs might actually be higher than the benefit. And when you see that, when the costs are greater than the benefits, now you're not going to really value that relationship. You'll try to terminate that relationship in most cases. To put it simply, your friend who used to be nice turned into a moocher, turned into somebody who's dependent and always asking you for all kinds of favors, and they never really pay you back in any real way. I'm sure we all have a friend like that we're trying to, get rid of, but for some reason they just kind of hang around. Something else that's really important when it comes to relationships is social status. So social status just refers to your level of social power and importance. Now, social status is, of course, relative. So we determine our level of social status by comparing ourselves to other individuals. And if you determine that somebody is below you, that's what we would call a downward comparison. You're just identifying people that are below you on some kind of social dimension. And if you identify people that are above you, then that would be called an upward comparison. And the basic idea is that we tend to value relationships with people who are above us on some kind of social dimension. We tend to desire to have relationships with people that are cool. We don't want to hang out with the nerds, the losers, the people that are below us in terms of social importance. Now, something that's definitely a major factor in any relationship is just, a wide range of forces that we call interpersonal attraction. And when I say attraction, I don't necessarily mean sexual attraction. That might be a part of it. But I'm really just talking about factors that make certain people more likely to be your friend. It's kind of like a social attraction. You just want to spend time with that person. One of the most important factors is proximity. So simply being around other people will make you be much more likely to be friends with those people. Like, we tend to be very likely to form relationships with our classmates, our coworkers, maybe even our neighbors, simply because we see them more often than other people. So physical, like geographical proximity. Another one would be mere exposure. This is kind of like proximity, except you don't necessarily need to meet the person or live near them. You just keep hearing about them. You keep seeing about them. Like, you see them on TV all the time. This is why a lot of us tend to kind of feel really positive towards a lot of celebrities. Like, if you watch a lot of, Kardashians or whatever, you probably feel like you have kind of a relationship with these characters, because you see them all the time, every day. It's like you know so much about them that you can't help but feel like you have some kind of a friendship with these people. But of course, physical attractiveness, like sexual attractiveness, is also an important factor. We tend to appreciate relationships with people who are at least as physically attractive as ourselves, if not more so. So the degree of a person's physical beauty is an important factor in any relationship. But this physical attractiveness influence is definitely going to be the most effective when it comes to strangers. So if you've been friends with somebody for a long time and they're kind of ugly, it's not a big deal. But when you make new friends, you're not very likely to make new friends with people that you think are unattractive. But as a lot of people would say, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That has some truth to it. Like, there is some kind of subjective quality to beauty, but there definitely does seem to be an objective quality as well. There's been a lot of interesting research into what kinds of people tend to be seen as the most physically attractive. And one of the most important factors that's been found is symmetry, specifically symmetry in people's faces. So the more symmetrical you are, the more balanced you are between the two halves of your face, the more attractive you'll tend to be. And here's an example. So these are a bunch of pictures taken from a study on face research that you can read more about on faceresearch.org. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a bunch of these pictures, and I just want you to, as quickly as possible, in just a few seconds, quickly scan all the pictures and decide who is the most attractive individual in this group. Okay, so here they are. All right, now stop. Who's the most attractive? Did you pick 4? You probably did. If you didn't pick 4, most people do, but that's not a big deal. Let's try again. So I'm going to show you another group of people, and I want you to once again quickly scan them all, try to determine who is the most attractive individual here. So here we go. Okay, stop. Now, who's the most attractive individual in this group? Did you pick number 2? That's what I would have expected. Number 2 here and number 4 on the previous example, they weren't actually real people. These are averages. If you take all of the other faces that are present and average their features together, what you'll get, in this case, is number 2. So this just really shows you that for most individuals, we tend to think that the most average looking people are the most attractive. So if you want to pay a compliment to somebody that you think is very pretty, you could say you're looking very average today. But of course, they probably wouldn't take that the right way. Now, something that's really interesting about people that are physically attractive is that we tend to think highly of them in general. Like, their physical attractiveness just makes us feel positive about them. Like, we generally think of them as kinder, smarter, more physically capable, and so on. So just by being pretty, they seem to be better people in general. This is called the halo effect. Beyond physical attractiveness and those other factors I mentioned, some other important elements of interpersonal attraction would be things like reciprocity. So we tend to be attracted towards people that are attracted to us. So if somebody clearly wants to be your friend and they're being nice to you and they're paying you compliments and things like that, it's just going to make you much more likely to, pay them back. It's kind of like that social exchange theory. When they are nice to you, you feel kind of obligated to be nice back to them, and that's how a lot of relationships can be formed. Another factor of interpersonal attraction would be similarity. So we tend to be attracted to people that are similar to us in many ways. So they have similar backgrounds, similar age, interests, attitudes, beliefs. Maybe they like to go to the same places, do the same kinds of activities, and so on. So we definitely do look for people that have a high degree of similarity to ourselves. So all those factors I just mentioned and those different theories I was talking about, we can use those to explain how most relationships work. But when we start talking about intimate relationships, like, in many cases, sexual relationships, now we have a few other important things to talk about, a few other important ideas that have been developed from research. The first of which I wanted to talk about is the matching hypothesis. And this really just expands on what I was just saying about the importance of similarity. When we're looking for a mate, when we're looking for somebody to be very intimate with, what we tend to value, what we tend to look for are, similarities. We want to find a partner that has a similar level of physical attractiveness, similar level of interests, and so on. Mismatched couples are much more likely to have a bad relationship or have an early end to their relationship. Evolutionary psychology also has a lot to say about how intimate relationships work. If you are familiar with, Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, just the basics of how evolution works. But this theory of natural selection doesn't explain something that's very, very obvious if you look at the animal kingdom. Charles Darwin simply could not explain why the males of most species tend to be, much more attractive, much more colorful, much more, interesting. They have big antlers and deers and colorful feathers and birds and things like that. Like, why is it that we tend to see that it's always the males that are the pretty ones for most animals? It wasn't until much later that he developed another theory. So this is his second, many people would say, the more interesting theory. It's called sexual selection. So according to his sexual selection theory, now he argued that because males invest so little when it comes to reproduction, they have to really advertise their qualities. They need to be very persuasive. They need to try to convince the women who have to spend so much time and effort to raise this baby. Not only do they have to carry it with mammals, but they then most of the time have to be the caregiver once the child is born. Because the females have to invest so much, they are much more choosy. So it's the females of most species that are selecting the males or rejecting the males. Whereas the males, on the other hand, they compete for access to the females. And you can see this with all kinds of animals. If you want to see a really cool video going into detail about sexual selection, I've included a link down below. So because of this, because men tend to compete for access to females, whereas females are more selective, what we tend to see are different preferences between the genders. Like, men are generally looking The males in many species are generally looking for females that are physically healthy and, just generally younger and more able to effectively produce and raise a child. So no man goes to a bar and starts looking around and asking himself, who's going to be the mother of my children? Well, hopefully they don't do that, because that would be super creepy. But that's kind of like it's like a subconscious thing. It's like a driving force. It's something that kind of pushes us towards certain kinds of preferences. So because of this, men tend to prefer younger, more physically, fit and more physically attractive women. Whereas women, they don't focus on that as much. With women, remember, they're being a lot more choosy. They're trying to find a male that will not only give them, good genes, but also potentially help them raise this child. Like, they don't want a male that's just going to, get them pregnant and run off. With human females, we want a male who's going to stick around and be a good father, be supportive, help the child in every conceivable way. So as a consequence, a lot of female, a lot of women tend to prefer males that are a bit older, more successful, have more resources, and so on. So that's why we tend to see kind of these weird mismatched couples where it's a very young woman and a older, rich man. Another theory I wanted to talk about is called the triangular theory of love, and this was developed by Robert Sternberg. So this triangular theory argues that there are three basic kinds of love, and when you combine them in different ways, you get more complex forms of love. So those three basic components are intimacy, so just feeling feeling close to somebody, feeling attached to somebody. Passion, which is just feeling like sexual, emotional feelings, and commitment, just being determined to stay with the person, despite, any other issues. So here's what that triangular theory of love looks like. And as you can see by looking at this model, there are different kinds. So if you have intimacy by itself, that just means you like to be close to somebody. But once you combine intimacy with passion, now that means you want to be close to a person and sexually intimate with them. So that's what we would call romantic love. Now, if you're only passionate about somebody, that just basically means you have a crush. You have like some kind of sexual fixation on a person. But once you combine passion with commitment, now that's much more serious kind of like dedication. It's like, we call it fatuous love, and that just means it might sound silly, but it's like you to this kind of sexual urge. Like, there's something about the person that just makes you want to, be with them all the time and have sex with them, all the time. But you don't necessarily want to be close to them. It's not like that person's a friend. It's just like that person is a outlet for your sexual urges. And then with commitment, like I said, now we're just talking about just feeling a deep sense of commitment to individual despite any other factor. And when you combine commitment with intimacy, now we're talking about a kind of love, a kind of companionate love, where you're just dedicated to this relationship where you're going to be close to an individual. It doesn't really involve anything to do with sex. It's kind of like a best friendship. It's just you want to stay with this person through thick and thin, and you love to be with them. But it's not until you combine all three of these different kinds of love until you can get what's called consummate love. So consummate love has relatively equal parts of each. And consummate love is what we tend to see in healthy, stable, long-running relationships. And just to wrap things up, there's a few other important factors when it comes to intimate relationships. We know that in general, both men and women across cultures rate the following four qualities as most important. Mutual attraction, so the person has to care the same way about you. Having a dependable character, so somebody who's stable. Emotional stability is another important factor, being mature, responsible. And then the fourth one would be pleasing disposition. You want somebody that makes you laugh. You want somebody that makes you smile. Somebody that you enjoy spending time with.